you, everyone. So I'm a journalist and editor. I'm a former editor of the art newspaper, and I would say the issues of artists' estates and problems connected to them have come up many times over the years that I've been writing about the art world. So today we're going to be talking about ways that artists can ensure, or at least try to ensure, their estates and legacies. It's actually a very sort of an issue that's had very, very, very long standing in a way. Michelangelo left an extensive archive and house to his nephew, which eventually, somewhere in the 19th century, made its way, was donated to the city of Florence and is still researched and used today. But another very famous artist, Modigliani, who many of you will know his work, had a chaotic life. He died young, died tragically. He didn't keep good records, and his market and museum shows have been plagued ever since, and particularly in recent years, with allegations of fakes and whether things are authentic or not. So the fact that he left things as he did he's still very famous, but it has dented, I would say, in some way, his reputation. We don't always know what he made. The contemporary art world is very complex, I think, it'd be fair to say. There's a lot of legal, tax and insurance issues involved with an artist's estate. And the artists I've mentioned are very famous, but many more just fade from history. People's reputations don't just keep going forever. There's no sort of guarantee that people will remember who you are. So to discuss how artists can do the best they can to leave things in good order, I'm joined by James Ferrer, who's head of fine art at Lockton, who specialises in bespoke insurance for the art world and started his career at Sotheby's, I believe, many years ago. Catherine Hill, she's a partner and head of art and cultural property at law firm Forsters, and you talk, I think, to a lot of artists on things like legacy and succession planning. And you also are the co-founder of something called Art Estate, which I think offers lower cost advice to artists on estate planning. In the middle is Nick Willing. He's a filmmaker, screenwriter and director, but you're here because you look after the estates of your late artist parents, Victor Willing and Paula Rego. I think many of you will know the work of Paula Rego. She's one of our most famous figurative painters, and I think the late Queen, made her a dame in 2010. Next to Nick, we have Ben Bowling, Emeritus Professor of Criminology at King's College London. Again, you're here because you are helping your father with your brother to look after his studio and future. His father is Frank Bowling, Sir Frank Bowling, again, one of our most famous abstract painters now, knighted in 2020, I think, Great. And has an enormous exhibition on at the Sao Paulo Biennial at the moment, at the age of 91. I think you've also got many museum exhibitions, Nick, underway at the moment. I think it's 23. So you're obviously doing a very good job. And then finally, Godfrey Worsdale. He's a curator and museum director, started his career at the British Museum, but is now director of the Henry Moore Foundation. And you look after Henry Moore's home at Perry Green, the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds, and everything to do with his work and catalogue raisonné and estate. Okay, I think perhaps we will start with you, Godfrey, because I think we've got three different artists here, very different attitudes to their legacies. So perhaps could you just give us a brief introduction to how Henry Moore thought about his work and particularly his legacy?
Absolutely, thank you very much. I usually start these presentations by pointing out that I'm probably representing the old man in the room, because Moore began to think about these things in the 1970s. But I'm relieved tonight to find out that Michelangelo was several centuries ahead of him. So, but for Henry Moore, he was obviously a very great sculptor, internationally renowned, amongst the great names of international modernism. But he was also a pretty impressive chap in many other senses. Amongst them, he was innovative, he was entrepreneurial, he was visionary, he was an excellent planner. And it makes no surprise to me at all, having learned a lot more about him as a person, that he foresaw why establishing a foundation would be sensible. There were one or two other foundations about, but not doing the things that Henry wanted. As I say, Henry Moore was a sculptor. He's incredibly well known for being a sculptor. But Henry Moore was also a phenomenal scholar. He was so learned across the whole history of sculpture in all cultures, all periods of history. He was incredibly fascinated by the way that sculpture had evolved over the centuries. And that scholarship, he believed, was fundamental to his progress. He was also, and it's worth mentioning Moore's start in life because it's highly relevant to his trajectory, but Moore was one of 8 children born to a coal miner in Castleford in Yorkshire. A very, very humble start. And he became phenomenally successful. He was successful as an artist, but he was financially successful. And I think when he reflected back on his life, the experiences he had to help him in that mobility were not lost on him. So when he came back from fighting in the First World War, he was to receive an ex-serviceman's grant, and that enabled him not to become the teacher, the school teacher that his parents desperately hoped might be the pinnacle of his hopes and ambitions. It meant he could go to Leeds College of Art. Once he was there, he was able to secure a scholarship. That meant he could go onto the Royal College of Art here. Someone helped him, Sir Michael Sadler, the phenomenal Vice-Chancellor of Leeds University, who was possibly Britain's greatest collector of modernism in the first couple of decades of this century. He assisted Henry Moore in lots of ways. Michael Rothenstein, the principal of the Royal College, did the same. As did a number of key people. They assisted Henry Moore. And I think he never forgot those critical moments where money came into his world and enabled him to go on. Yes, he was very talented, but that might not have been enough for him. So the principle of being generous to people was very important. So eventually, the idea of setting up the foundation wasn't just predicated on simply enabling the world to remember who Henry Moore was, or Henry Moore the artist was, but that it might be an expression of these different characteristics. So, as is mentioned, the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds is a centre for the scholarship of sculpture. It was very much a part of his mission that other people should be enabled to learn about this phenomenal field of interest. Moore also established within the Foundation's principles a grant-giving programme. Over the decades, we've given north of £30 million to assist sculpture exhibitions, to enable artists through the museums and galleries that they work with to achieve greater and better things. And those awards have been distributed internationally. As his parents may have hoped in his early life, he did teach. He taught passionately. He believed in education. He believed in teaching. He believed in learning. And so the charitable purpose of the Henry Moore Foundation it's slightly old-fashioned language now, but in the 70s it was the parlance. And so it was established to support the public in their education and appreciation of visual art, and sculpture in particular. And so that became an important part. Moore was also a great advocate. He stood up for the arts, but he also stood up for other things he believed in. And so pulling all these things together, these different characteristics and values of Moore, are now the defining principles of his foundation. And
can I ask Godfrey, he died in 1986. When did he start planning all this?
So I think he'd been planning it since the early 70s. The foundation came into being 76, 77, and Moore dies in 86. So he didn't just deliver his idea, but he oversaw it for the first decade.
Yeah.
And those principles and those directions are still very resonant to us 40 years later.
Ben, can I ask about your father? He's obviously he's alive and still working, as we said. But I think my understanding was that he didn't think about the future. He was busy making his work, but at some point that changed. And I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about when things started to change, when he started to realise he didn't just want to leave everything to chance.
Well, I think it probably goes back quite a long way. I think the first conversation I had with him about his artistic estate and what would happen was around 1999 or 2000.
So actually 25 years ago. Okay.
25 years ago. And he might have sort of made a remark over dinner at some point about, that somebody one day would have to deal with all this stuff. But I remember it because I just started as a lecturer in law at King's College London. And I went out for lunch with a colleague who was a tax lawyer, and a casual conversation, and he told me that, in his opinion, artists could be very cruel. They live these sometimes quite louche lives with sort of freedom and quite often lots of partners and lots of children and lots of art all over the place. And then they die and leave a terrible mess. And in his view, that was a kind of cruelty because it was entirely foreseeable about how it would turn out. So I, at that point, started talking to my dad about that and also with my brother. But it wasn't until 2018 that my involvement really kind of started in earnest. We went, Sasha, my brother and I went to Berlin to an organization called the Institute for Artists' Estates. And that was like a crash course in what it was like to manage an estate. From everything from dealing with complicated family dynamics and the emotions that were involved. What does a good gallery look like? What's the difference between a commercial gallery and a museum? I heard the phrase catalogue raisonné for the first time. And we were a group of about 20 artists, children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, the old studio assistant. And so we came back, Sasha and I, from that experience to begin the conversation about how we might think ahead to all that was required.
And was there something particular that prompted you to do that in 2018? Was it just the fact you'd heard about the conference, or was your father unwell, or what had prompted you?
So that's a good question. So it actually came from our former gallery. I think that they were concerned about the future, and who, by this time, Dad was well into his 80s, and they were, wondering about who was going to look after this stuff when Dad was no longer around. So it came from the gallery, or one of the galleries that represented Dad. But then we got catapulted into action because the relationship with the former gallery collapsed quite sort of dramatically after the Tate show. And we had to step in. And at that point, my dad didn't have any kind of studio infrastructure at all.
So what, no studio manager?
No studio manager.
No assistants?
No, there was an untrained, rather gifted photographer, and untrained as an archivist who'd done all the work to preserve Dad's archive, which was bags and bundles of material. You probably would call him a hoarder, but for the fact that he's like an emerging artist at 91. So we now have an incredible archive. But I don't think we even had a bookkeeper.
Right, you really had to get to grips with it.
It was a baptism of fire. We had to get to grips with it very, very quickly. And we sort of developed and learned from there, developed a sort of, strategic plan and so on. And I think that, in 2020, Dad's health was very poor. And we even got to the point of, preparing to say goodbye, really. But that's now 5 years ago. He pulled through. And I think for us, Sasha and I, we feel like we've been given the gift of time to work through a whole lot of things that would have been much, much more complicated if he had gone in 2020 than where we are now, where we've been able to work through a huge amount of all kinds of things, including the setting up of a foundation, which is now sort of nascent, really, 18 months old, but just kind of beginning its work. So, and I think one of the things that we've been able to do, which has made a huge difference, is that we established a protocol where Sasha and I would meet with my dad and his wife, our stepmom Rachel, every Thursday evening, 4:00, to take their instructions, to discuss with them what has come into the system. So having that kind of constant dialogue between my dad and stepmom has been absolutely crucial to ensure a kind of smooth sort of trajectory and anticipating the moment when it will be, not an about to be estate, but will become an estate. And at 91, he knows that he's got less time on the planet than he's had so far.
It does show, though, what a sort of emotional and sensitive subject it is, and also a very complicated one, because all the actual practical side of dealing with everything is. I mean, I think you said that the art world was a very steep learning curve for you and your brother. Nick, you were left in a more difficult situation, I think, in that. Well, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your mother's attitude to her legacy.
She'd either say, "Don't worry, darling, I'm not going to die," or she'd run round the flat shouting, "King Lear, King Lear," when me and my sisters tried to, sometimes in her underpants. And the reason we talked to her about it was because I got a call. I was quite happily living my life in Los Angeles, making movies there. And Mum called me in tears because the Portuguese country, Portugal, had gone bankrupt. I don't know if you remember, it went bankrupt with Greece and Ireland in 2012. We called it the crise.
And for people who don't know, Paula Rego was born in Portugal.
Paula Rego was born in Portugal. She's Portuguese, but she only carried a British passport because she lived here, and she married an Englishman called Willing, which is why I'm called Willing. And so she called me and she said, and she'd lent almost her entire collection to the museum that had been built for her in Cascais in Lisbon. If you haven't been, it's fantastic. I highly recommend it. But because of the crise, as they called it, the crisis, the government, the Troika came in from the EU, and the government decided to abolish her foundation, which they had passed as a statute of government in the Portuguese Parliament. But now they decided no. And the problem with this, she thought, was that her collection, a vast collection that she had lent to the museum, was not going to be able to leave the country. And there was another looming possibility that they might turn it into what they call Patrimonio Nacional, which is national heritage. You have it with your Henry Moores, is a national treasure, and the Portuguese consider Paula as a national treasure too. So she was terrified that she was going to lose this. And then my sister got on the phone and said, "Nick, you do realise that if Mum dies and we can't get the collection out of the museum, we might have to pay the British government 40% in inheritance tax, but not be able to release the pictures in order to sell them, because they'll be stuck in Portugal. And if the picture is national heritage, has a national heritage order over it, you can't get it out of the country and you can't sell it." So she said, "You've got to go over there and sort it out."
And as I can imagine, this will turn into. Well, I think you're still wrestling with this.
I bought a very fine suit and hired a Portuguese lawyer called Carlos Monteiro, and went over there and negotiated with the president, the Minister of Culture, and 7 lawyers, and me and Carlos. And he had a panic attack on the first day, couldn't speak, which wasn't a help. But eventually, it took 6 weeks, we managed to come to a kind of arrangement. And one of the things is I was left looking after, and I'm still looking after the museum in Portugal, but I also ended up looking after Paula's business. And because there was such a giant collection, which I eventually had returned to London before she died, thank God, after Brexit, but before she died. Because of that, we had to approach the thorny subject of her death and what we would be left with should she die. And it's a nightmare. And she wouldn't talk about it. She had grown up in the Portuguese fascist dictatorship of Salazar, The revolution was only in 74, so I also grew up in a fascist dictatorship, and everybody hid their shit under the bed, you know. They never told you what they had. So now she was still hiding shit under the bed. And I still find stuff under her bed. I mean, I found 2 paintings stashed in a corner of her studio only last week, rolled up, you know, from the 90s.
And apart from paintings, and you've got drawings, you've got archival material, you've got a studio, and all of this was basically left to you and your sisters to sort out.
Yes, and Catherine helped us.
Right.
She was fantastic.
This might be a good moment to move to Catherine. And I mean, did your mother have a will at all? No.
Yes,
She did have a will.
God,
She did have a will. Okay.
No, if we hadn't had a will, if she died in intestate, that would have been a disaster. No, we did manage to convince her to write a will.
She had a very simple one originally. And
Yes.
I said that that's all very well. Am I allowed to say?
Please.
That everything I have divided between my children, but each of you have children of your own. And if Nick had died at a time when Paula also then died and we had minor children, as the lawyer, you're a bit stuck. You can't vary the will. I mean, I'm sure you've read about this, the ability, if you have 3 adults, to effectively redirect what they inherit. And we didn't have necessarily, we might not have had the flexibility. So the first thing we did was change the will so that it was a discretionary, effectively large pot, that as a group we could then work with that to decide how things would best be placed once she had died.
Now, I don't know if we have any artists in the audience, or maybe relatives of artists in the audience, but I suppose my first question to you, Catherine, really is around what's the most essential thing that people ideally need to do? Because it's obviously quite tough, I think, when somebody dies, if you end up then having to sort out things when you're grieving in that terrible period, which can last a very long time. So what can you do to spare your relatives' pain?
I think the most obvious point, which I'll state, is please get a will signed. More than half the country die intestate. And what that does, if you're married with children, for example, is trigger an unnecessary payment of inheritance tax because your children are not exempt, unlike your spouse. And you've walked into a situation where your estate is divided half between them. So that can be a disaster. If you have a long-term partner, they won't benefit at all unless there are other adults who wish to pass on what they inherit, or unless they make a claim and bring proceedings so that they get some form of financial provision. That's messy. What if your artist has a studio in France or some foreign property? When we're talking about civil law countries, we've then got succession rules that apply over there, as well as all the complications Nick's just mentioned. So those all need to be addressed, and they can be in a simple will, which at my firm and at Art Estate, we will always advise should be discretionary, and therefore requires you to choose your trustees carefully. And in the course of that discussion, we'll then look at what do you own? I mean, how many artists think maybe they've gone so far with planning, but they haven't understood that the company that was incorporated in 1995 effectively owns the work from that date onwards. But what about all the earlier work? You know, where do your intellectual property rights sit? So there are all these sort of practical issues that need to be looked at as part of that.
And from an insurance perspective, James, I mean, if nothing is planned for, does that mean your work's left uninsured? And you know, if there's a fire or theft or whatever, you're in trouble.
Yeah, potentially. I think I was talking to an artist, the other day, who has an apartment, and unfortunately there was a leak from the ceiling that had come through from upstairs, nothing to do with him, and it had damaged some of the works that he'd just been working on for a gallery show. And unfortunately, he didn't have any insurance. I'm not just making this up, by the way. It did actually happen. And so we were trying to work out, you know, obviously he then has to rely on the person above him and their insurance, and it's a struggle, and it shouldn't have to be necessarily. But I think it's probably born out of the fact that often, you know, artists lead a fairly precarious existence when they're starting out. You know, they don't necessarily have the backing and the funding that they need. And sometimes, all of a sudden, you're very successful and your artworks are worth quite a lot of money. And at that point, you need to think, well, actually, it's probably about time that I address this. And one of the things that struck me, actually, when I visited Perry Green, when Sebastiano was very kindly showing me around, when I was talking to Sebastiano saying, God, it must be such a weird situation for the family, because all of a sudden your home is being turned into a place that's open to the public. And just at that moment, Henry Moore's grandson came walking across the lawn, and so we were able to have a conversation about it. And I think it's just that realization that you need to take action. And as you were saying, Catherine, is like just realizing what structures you have to put in place to manage that.
Now, tax is obviously a big part of this, isn't it? And my understanding is that there have been changes to tax rules around family businesses. We've all heard about it because of the farmers, but this is actually very likely to affect artists, isn't it? Because again, we'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but my understanding is that in a lot of cases, you've got the artist studios running as a trading business, and you used to be able to pass that on as a business.
That's right. So, I mean, inheritance tax is very simple in that it's 325,000 is free of tax. Everything above that is charged to 40%, unless you give it to your spouse or a charity, which is where we'll come on to discuss later, or the asset itself has a special relief, and that's what's changing in April 2026. So artists who are working up to the point when they die have a form of practice. Even if it's not successful, you just need to be doing something with a view to making a profit one day. Revenue might resist it if you never make any money. But that business has always been exempt, and that meant one can move the assets around and ensure that you pass them on down a generation, not necessarily to your husband or wife, or indeed transfer them to anyone, to another, like to a company.
So you're saying that if it was set up as a company, you could pass it on to a member of your family, and they can carry on running it, selling work through galleries or whatever as a going business.
As a business.
And that was exempt.
That was exempt, and it may not be a company. A lot of artists are still traders still, or indeed in partnership, in fact. So from April 26, they have said that the first £1 million of value is exempt, and the balance will be taxed at 20%. Now that sounds, when you think about the body of work, and I don't mean at the levels of the Bowling family or the Rago family. For some artists, they might be able to, we'll come on maybe to talk about valuation, argue a lower figure, but you mentioned the studio. Many artists have something, East End of London somewhere, and that will probably tick the £1 million box straight away.
Almost certainly now, yeah.
So it's a real problem.
Valuation, in fact, is another big issue, isn't it? And I think that's something that certainly affected you, Nick, and in that, you know, at the point when somebody dies and that people are looking to value it for things like inheritance tax, valuing art is notoriously difficult. So to talk us through some of the problems that one faces there.
The starting point is that you have to supply, when someone dies, an open market value of what they have. And our rules in the UK say that we're not allowed to apply what the Americans call a blockage discount, which means it's a fire sale, the prices will bomb in the market, and you need to therefore reduce the value of what you have.
So basically, if you flooded the market, if you put everything up for sale straight away, you will basically slash the value of the work, essentially.
We're not allowed to argue that that is what would happen. And we have to imagine a piecemeal sale of every single item, which of itself, that is already an issue which I think needs debating and perhaps lobbying over. You then have to imagine you have a willing buyer and a willing seller. And what the revenue will do is to go straight to secondary market auction prices for their starting point. And as you can predict, very often what they might select is not going to be a comparable for what actually remains in an artist's studio. So the arguments that you need to consider are they comparable, condition of the items, Are the items owned jointly? There may be a partnership already with the artist and children, or indeed it may be an inherited estate where you have family members sharing, in which case you can apply some form of discount. You've got to look at, obviously, the particular market sector and whether that has changed in terms of what the revenue have selected, cherry-picked for their arguments. And then there may be arguments, if we're thinking of Prince and Christopher Roberts, perhaps, that multiples then will be able to be discounted. But it's definitely an art form, and it's not easy to conclude with any single artist where you might end up.
And you could end up with a very nasty tax bill that you couldn't possibly meet through sales of works. Is that correct?
That is
Yes, what they tell you is that they'll lend you the money
Yes.
and then you pay interest. And we worked out...
The HMRC will lend you the money.
HMRC, and we worked out, if we were in for the 40% inheritance tax, that the interest would be something like 2 million a year.
Yeah, it compounds. So you're allowed to pay over a 10-year period if you have a business.
But we couldn't pay the interest.
Yeah.
We'd sell our houses, we'd sell the children, but you know, they're not worth that much. They're old, you know. And the problem is that you can't sell artwork easily. It's not like, you know, having a commodity that lots of people want. It's a luxury product, and the sale of the thing about the valuation, we were told we had to do a proper primary market valuation.
Yes, and that was based on Paula's profile.
And that was based on Paula's profile.
And the fact we were confident we had business property relief. So
well, we didn't, yeah, I never was confident. I just don't trust governments. I was brought up in a fascist dictatorship, I suppose. But we did get business property relief, and thank God, because we wouldn't have been able to manage. And the thing about the new 20% for artists, and you might think this is a champagne problem, but you're leaving it to kids that have nothing to do with this. They don't understand the art world. They've got trying to get on in their own lives, and suddenly they're hit with this massive burden of having to find 20% of the value of this vast collection, the properties, the studios, the blah, 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 right?
Well, our working assumption from the beginning of work for Dad was that there would be business property relief, and exactly as you described it. And even when the rumour mill began, whenever it was, I suppose it was soon after the election of the last government, I think the general view was they're never going to do that. They're never going to do that. It's going to be fine. And it has turned out otherwise. So Dad's alive and well, and long may he last. So assuming that he survives beyond April 26th, then we will be looking at trying to understand the implications, exactly as has been described here, and work out what on earth we're going to do. I mean, 2 or 3 things that are already in train. So the Frank Bowling Foundation now exists. So if you give art to charity, that comes out of the estate. So that's, and it's something that we actually learned a lot from the Henry Moore Foundation. We read a lot, and we looked at so when you describe the charitable aim, it sounds very similar to ours, the promotion of the public appreciation of art and culture, especially through the work of Frank Bowling. I think we just did it, we copied it basically from the Henry Moore Foundation. So that helps. There are other...
It's becoming more complicated, though, and it's about to become much more complicated, isn't it? I want to talk about the Charities Commission.
Yeah, well, maybe we should talk a little bit about foundations anyway, because foundations are something we hear about a lot in America, but they don't exist in the same way here, do they? You've basically, your decision, forgive me if I'm really simplifying, is your decision is you might have a trading arm and you might have a charitable arm, you might have both, or you might have the one or the other. And it sounds like it's pretty important to work out what you're trying to do with this, let's call it foundation, which might have a business or might be all charitable. The better that's worked out, I imagine, the better the scenario.
That's right, and I think it's important to make the point that there are many charities in existence which are doing good things in the art world, and in fact there are artists who have set up grant-making charities. That of itself is actually quite an easy thing to do. I think where it's more tricky is to go down the route that Nick and Ben have enjoyed so much, to set up a foundation which has that dual, well, it's designed to preserve the legacy, but also it has to be self-sustaining. Now, historically, charities were set up, typically, the older ones, as some form of trust, and then the non-charitable commercial activities had to be carried out through a separate vehicle, because that was obviously not charitable of itself. And then the profits were farmed up to the trust.
So you could sell works, for example, to give to the charity, to give to grants, for example.
If you had constructed it correctly at the outset, yes. And then in 2013, the Charity Commission introduced the charitable incorporated organisations. The idea being to try and just smooth the path a little for everyone, to have a sort of protocol document, standard form documents, which you can amend to a degree. And you have limited liability within the structure, which you wouldn't have in the old trust system, but you could also trade. So there is a simpler system, but I think you would both say it's not a walk in the park in terms of satisfying the Charity Commission. It's very easy to think that you just say, I want to do good.
No,
and
the
they tick
charity,
box.
they're quite tough. And they stay on your case. And there's a lot of work in running a business trying to sell art, and that's also promoting the artist's legacy. Because one of the things I think that it's important to understand is that the majority of artists, when they die, their market crashes. The artists whose market rises after a bit are the artists that achieve a sort of legacy status. But legacy artists are very few in Britain. I mean, I can name a handful, but there are literally thousands of artists dying every year. So the majority of artists who die, their work and their market collapses. And so if you're left with all this work and you're valuing it at the point of death, it may be that in a year's time you won't be able to sell anything, let alone achieve that price, you see. So part of also the job of the people left holding the baby is to try and develop that artist's legacy in a way that makes them museum-worthy all over the world. That's the big test, is an artist that gets shows in the Met and Moot Museum and the major international museums after their deaths retains a kind of cachet which bolsters their market, you see? And then you can then continue to sell the work, perhaps even at a profit, or even increase the value. And I mean, now Francis Bacon, who is obviously a legacy artist, Henry Moore, I don't know his price, but Francis Bacon goes for 80 million. And you said a Henry Moore drawing was sold at auction for 2.5 million.
The record at the moment for a drawing is 2.5.
For a
Yeah.
drawing.
Yeah.
If I might interject, I think the point, if I'm allowed to use Paula's estate as an example, because she died when we are under the old rules, you as a family had the luxury of knowing that you had business property relief, and you've had that time period to be able to construct the foundation, to work out what it is you think will work and what won't work. And it's been very successful. Query what will happen from April 26 when we just don't know. How can any artist know actually what's going to be there in monetary terms to support the legacy, and how will we go about addressing that?
And 20% is a lot because a lot of artists, I also inherited the work of another artist, Keith Sutton, who has no value, but he left 200 paintings. They literally are worth £5 each or something. And my dad's work, which does have value, it wasn't a huge collection. But with Mum, she had a massive collection, things that she'd hid under the bed. But also, you know, just her collection that I brought back from the museum in Portugal, collection that goes back 70 years of work, you see. And each piece of paper with a drawing on it, and we have literally thousands, have a value because one drawing went up at auction, got £26,000. So all these drawings must each be... No.
Of course they're not.
Can you imagine? It's millions and millions of pounds, even though you can't sell any of them. Or you could sell one every 6 months maybe or something. I don't know. But it's not easy to sell art.
Can I just add a tiny point, because I want to give some hope to people out there.
Hope?
For those artists where we're looking at smaller values, there is work being done by advisors. When you take an artist who's a sole trader, who might have adult children who could come into partnership now, while we have all these reliefs, you can bring them in. And then you have 3 or 4 sets of £1 million exemption. So there's quite a bit of planning going on in our world to look at that.
Yeah. What are the critical insurance things that need to be sorted out, James? And again, I'm guessing it's better to not leave this till the last minute.
Well, I was thinking actually that, you know, we get the easy part of the deal because I think Catherine's basically done all the hard work by the time it gets to us. But no, I think with an artist, you can insure the artist studio, so you can insure the artworks whilst they're in progress, and it's a fraction of the actual market retail value of the work. But when it transitions into a foundation, it becomes a different thing. And so most of the policies that we deal with are agreed value. So you put a value on it. The most important thing is to have the schedule, to be very clear about what the artworks are, how much they're insured for, and where they're located. But I think one of the ironic things is that if you don't have a specialised policy, and under some household policies, they have something called death of the artist cover, which blanket means you get a 10% increase when the artist dies.
It wasn't the value.
Exactly.
They think the value increases
It
by
just
10%.
automatically goes up, which sort of slightly goes completely contrary to...
It goes contrary to life.
Exactly.
Or death.
It's just not like that.
But also one of the interesting things you mentioned there was the fact that you have a complete schedule of all the works, everything you've got. Now, I think step number 1, lots of people don't do that. And then, but step number 2, what you really want as well, somebody mentioned, I think, the word catalogue raisonné. I think it was you, Ben. You said you didn't know what it was, and many people here, not everyone will know. I mean, a catalogue raisonné is basically the agreed list of what an artist has produced. And these can be very, very contested documents. I mean, the Rembrandt catalogue raisonné famously shrinks every time the committee has a major meeting. So I'm interested in catalogue raisonné because they're one of the most difficult areas for foundations to manage, aren't they? Because people will come and say, I've got a Henry Moore, or I've got a Paul Arago, or I've got a
Happens every week.
Frank Bowling.
I get a fake every week.
Now, your father's alive, so he can say, no, it's not by me. I mean, how do you deal with this area? Because, I mean, people can be very upset if you say this painting isn't what you think it is.
I mean, we haven't really had to encounter that at this stage, partly because Dad's alive and Rachel is an amazing person. She has been the kind of keeper, the record maker, and so she recognises everything. Amongst the really good things that our former gallery did was to insist on photographs and also creating a database. So we have a database which is pretty comprehensive, and the areas where we don't know, you know, I think we've only, I mean, hearing your stories about the number of fakes coming, I think we've had 1 or 2, and I think that we'll probably be okay. The question of the catalogue raisonné more generally is a vexed one, because, you know, we're still looking for works, and actually doing the work required to create an agreed list is we're a long way away from that. But I mean, we've also learnt a lot from the Henry Moore Foundation.
What's the position with the Henry Moore Foundation? Do you authenticate work?
No.
And is that because of the legal and insurance risks of it?
We do not authenticate. I would advise all artists to, if they haven't, to start preparing their catalogues raisonné tomorrow. The sooner you start, the better job you'll make of it. The idea of descendants trying to cobble together in the right order, correct or incorrect, posthumously is obviously going to be more of a challenge. We hold 3-4 times each year a committee meeting which we call our review panel, and we review items for possible inclusion in the catalogue raisonné. And having your work included in the catalogue raisonné means that in the opinion of that panel, the Foundation believes that this work is by Henry Moore. Then we have this massive disclaimer. And if you look on our catalogue raisonné online, it points out that we believe these items belong in the catalogue raisonné based on the available information. I'm not sure if this is true, but anecdotally, Picasso in later life, in the position that Frank is now, would be approached. Did you make this drawing? Dated 1932? Apparently, if it was a stinker that Picasso remembered doing, it was out. Yeah. But if he knew he hadn't done it, but it was a gorgeous drawing, he had it. And conceptually, I'm not altogether against that approach. But for us, 40-odd years after Henry's life, I reckon maybe in an average year, probably 15 works still are being added to the catalogue raisonné.
Can you protect yourself there? Because I think the Warhol Foundation famously withdrew from authentication and because of this problem. But is it something that you can insure yourself against, James, or is it protect yourself from legal claims? I mean, even somebody saying you're not going to put something in the catalogue raisonné, which is not the same as saying it's fake, but just you're not satisfied it's clear enough to go in.
Yeah, it sits alongside the same for art dealers when they're providing valuations for artwork. So it falls under professional indemnity. And that means that you have a limit up to a certain amount that says that unless you've done your due diligence, that you've researched the work properly, that you can have cover for your professional negligence, essentially. So the limits are quite low. And the risks are very high for the insurers, so the premiums tend to be very high.
Right.
So it's not the greatest seller.
So this is another tricky area for people like Nick and Ben.
It's worth mentioning that America is ahead of us because of their litigious nature, and many of the foundations have, and Nick's aware of this, submissions agreements, and we do draft those, but they're designed to say, yes, we'll look at the work, there's no guarantee what we'll say to you, and by the way, there's a large exoneration clause and we're not liable for anything.
Yeah. What I would add on this, which sorry, excuse me.
They're problematic in that someone has to still enforce those terms.
I mean, one of the things that we contemplated, because we did, looking at what was going on in the States, we did say maybe we should desist here because we don't want to get into big trouble. The reason we carried on doing it with all the caveats is because we reckon that if we weren't on the table doing it, very quickly somebody commercially would take over.
That's the thing.
Yeah, and also you want to have, ideally, a good catalogue raisonné. You want to have a good, clear body of work. We started a little bit late, but we promised that we'd allow some questions. So I don't know if there's anybody who would like to ask the panel some questions. I'm looking into the gloom a bit. I'm looking into, yes, gentleman in the middle.
No, there isn't. In the UK, charities last effectively indefinitely. They have no trust period.
Yeah, good.
But they can collapse if they're not properly funded. And then where does all the work go? See, you have to be very careful how you set it up.
Once you are a charity and you're at risk of collapse, you usually will apply to the Charity Commission, something called a CPRE scheme, to blend it in somewhere appropriate elsewhere.
And you need a sort of get-out strategy, don't you?
You do.
In your business plan.
Exactly right.
Godfrey? sorry, I think Godfrey, you wanted to say something
Just,
on that point.
I think this is quite important. The Henry Moore Foundation, notionally, although it's not set out anywhere, is destined to exist in perpetuity, which is a crazy thought in some senses, but we're very well endowed. We have ways to generate further income through all sorts of licensing and touring exhibition programs and ticket sales, etc. But it's still, even with all our resources, it's still a challenge to think that how will we be here in 50 years' time? Many smart, possibly slightly less well-endowed foundations have a very, very clear direction of travel. So if we take the joint foundation of Robert Smithson and Nancy Holt, their foundation was determined to last for 20 years. And in those 20 years, they had a list of to-dos. And one to-do was to place work in key museums. Another one was to publish key texts on certain aspects of the work and complete the catalogue raisonné. And there was enough in the tank, I think, time will tell, but to get those objectives done. And then why spend the rest of eternity desperately scratching away to try and sustain something that may not need to be sustained? Because you don't, I mean, we hold a large collection of works, but does the foundation have to do that for Henry Moore? They could be distributed to museums all around the world instead. So I think life expectancy is a really, really key question.
And links back in. Sorry.
I think that would be Catherine's
The
question.
tax implication of closing a charity, generally speaking, it will only ever be the proceeds or the assets realised to achieve another charitable purpose. It may not have been the original one. So it's not a case of being able to close your charity and have the money back, I'm afraid. It's a one-way ticket.
But what about if you ran all the money down, if the money's just been
And
run
it will
down
naturally expire,
to achieve the aim of
And I think I was going to say it ties in with having a discretionary, flexible will. You know, these discussions around, is this a sunset legacy with a fixed period or is it in perpetuity? It's hard to be realistic when you're sitting there today in 2025 to know what it's going to be. So that's why flex is so important right at the beginning with the wills.
We don't have flex though.
I must say, I rather like the idea of perpetuity. I mean, particularly when you think about someone like Henry Moore, these durable, monumental sculptures.
Yeah.
The idea that they will exist in perpetuity and that there is a committed a group of people and an organisation that will sort of curate, shepherd, marshal, sort of support that. And then it becomes something, has the solidity, not just of the sculptures, but of a museum. And the idea of that I find extremely attractive and enviable. I want it for my dad.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Until Henry Moore gets cancelled because of something somebody found out he said in 1935.
No, but this is something that we think about a lot.
Yeah.
Because our business model is to some extent predicated on the fact that there does seem to be an inexhaustible interest in the artist. And you only need look at Picasso for the many things he said and, more importantly, did for most of his career. And this has been something that's been scrutinised, especially in recent years.
Yeah, that's true. There was an especially controversial show, I think. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
But it needs planning. I was just thinking, I've mentioned before at other talks, Clifford Still, his will said, I leave all my work to whichever museum will take it. 24 years later, Denver took it. But
it's a long wait, yeah.
Can you imagine what they were going
it's a
through?
big deal for a museum to look after such a large amount of work.
exactly.
Well, there's another really crucial element here, which is, as was said earlier, about the way that artists can sort of disappear. One of the things that came out of the Institute for Artists' Estates workshop was the importance of keeping the work alive, finding new audiences, ways of interpreting the work, particularly finding some resonance with younger people. And what I've found, and we have, my wife Susie supports the educational aspects of the student and eventually the foundation, is that primary school children love the idea of throwing paint around. It's much a more interesting way to learn about art and creativity than learning how to draw perspective, which I seem to learn every year as a school child in art. And so I think the idea of having a dedicated group of people, whether it's family or a foundation, whose job it is to bring the art to a new generation and find ways that it, resonates. I mean, in Sao Paulo, I did a talk we were expecting a half dozen art students to turn up, and 80 turned up, and did a talk about the work in front of the work. And I got to the end of the talk and said that, my dad would almost certainly would not return to South America, the continent of his birth. And all these 20-year-olds burst into tears at the thought that this 91-year-old man would not return to South America. And so there was a kind of resonance there. And so I think that, for me, what the Henry Moore Foundation has done is absolutely fantastic and not to be taken too lightly. I think you've done, you individually, but also the foundation.
40, 50 years of...
Yeah. That's actually really crucial. I think it's a tremendous role model.
And that's the task
young.
of museums
Yes.
too, in the sense that if legacies are left to museums in dark storage rooms, the job for them to be sifting through and recreating connections is a huge one for the future.
Yeah. I mean, there is another question. We'll make this the final question and then we'll wrap up. No, please ask your question. We're just getting the microphone. No, it's an enormous topic. We've only skimmed the surface.
Okay, as Jessica Carlisle, I work with Catherine at Art Estate, and slightly going to challenge what Catherine said, actually. Most important thing you said was getting a will, but I would say communication, talking as a family, if you've got children, is really critical, and it was really interesting to hear you both saying, prompting your parents to have this discussion. When people come up to us at Art Estate, that is very often the case. It also works the other way around. The artists quite want to talk about it, but the children want to block their ears. But I think this idea of communication, so that as well as being hit by grief, they sort of know what their parents' wishes were. But the point I told you, I try not to talk too long, but the point that you just raised about this act of custodian, what happens when there are children or children who can't simply do the amount of work that you guys are doing? We work with a number of estates and the children are very committed. And Art Estate is very committed, but there's a lot that falls between those two roles, and I just wonder if there's a bit of a shift in the art world and we'll find more professionals. I don't even know how you define the role, whether it's an agent or manager or curator, that effectively manage estates and somewhere between a gallery and the family. And I see this perhaps as a new role emerging, and I don't know what anyone's thoughts or experiences are.
Would you like to comment on that, Godfrey?
I think it's a great question and a really, really important point, and I think it will be a growth area. Looking back over the history of Henry Moore's Foundation, if you look at the artists who he's supported, many of those artists are now reaching a certain age and they're thinking about their foundations and they're looking back at the Henry Moore Foundation model and are developing their foundations in a generous and giving way. And we may feel a bit concerned about the future of arts funding in the next decade or two. And I think if you look at what goes on in America, who are further down the line, and the number of artist foundations that are supporting the visual arts over there, it's important that we do try and enable artists. I'm just picking up on one of Ben's points. For further reading homework, I would recommend Loretta Würtenberger's book, which is linked to the Institute of Artists Estates, based over in Germany, and also the World Art Foundations Group, which is still a relatively young organization, but is a fabulous center for the sharing of knowledge about how foundations can work. And I think it is one of the most important growth areas in our sector, and I feel it needs to be.
Yeah, and thank you for that very useful piece of advice. There will be opportunities to talk with our speakers afterwards, so I'd like to say thank you very much to them. I think that most of you are going to go and have a look at the Itel Colquhoun show after this talk. And I think it's interesting to think about her because she really fell from view for many, many, many years. And it's incredibly fortunate that she donated her works and archives to the National Trust and the Tate, and that they were finally reunited in the Tate in 2019. And that's really helped, I think, the greater understanding of her work that's been happening. Her work has started appearing in biennales and exhibitions again, and obviously this show here. So I think, I mean, and it could have been very different for her. So I think if there's any message out of this, it's try not to leave things to chance. Thank you very much, everyone.